Hello, friends. Patrick McFarlane here of the Liberty Weekly podcast. Welcome to episode 51. This one is entitled Turkey invades Syria in pursuit of the Syrian Kurds. And I'm joined by Kyle Anzalone, who is the resident foreign policy expert here at the Libertarian Union.
Pat, the audio cut out there a little bit. I don't know if we could stop you real quick while we just get started. Yeah. Sorry about that. It just like completely blanked out. So hopefully it's going to, I just don't want it to keep happening.
Oh, okay. I'll start again. Technical difficulties. Hello, friends. Patrick McFarlane here of the Liberty Weekly podcast. Welcome to episode 51, which is entitled Turkey Invades Syria in Pursuit of the Syrian Kurds. And joining me today is Kyle Anzalone, the resident foreign policy expert at the Libertarian Union, also a contributor at the Libertarian Institute, which is Scott Horton's project. Thanks for joining me, Kyle. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
No problem, Kyle. Always glad to have you on. I wish it was with better news because this weekend we heard that Turkey invaded Syria. Do you want to tell us, just brief us a little bit on that situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was somewhat, I guess, expected and somewhat unexpected. Turkey has been threatening to invade Syria and tap the Kurds since at least 2014, if not since the beginning of the war. Whenever Assad was really fighting the Free Syrian Army, which turns out to really just be al-Nusra in Syria, the Kurds really gained an independent state and fight ISIS and now control a large portion of eastern Syria, and also an enclave in kind of north-central Syria there called the Afrin province. What's happened is that this province is controlled by the Turkish or the Syrian Kurds, and actually I could share the show and kind of or share the screen here, and this may make it easier for everyone to kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. So kind of this area right here in Syria, and I may actually be over a little bit this way, a little bit more, is where the Afrin province is. And now Turkey, which as you see is the big country on top of Syria there, has invaded, moving south, attacking the YPG. The Kurdish population in general controls like a large portion of this area here. However, they've kind of been able to move western a little bit and south in Syria since the start of the Syrian civil war. And you know, like I said, that's largely been because Assad was fighting other countries in the region, or not other countries, but other terrorist organizations in the region, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and stuff like that.
Okay, so who exactly are the Kurds, for the benefit of our listeners who may not be too privy on foreign policy issues, but who are they?
So the Kurdish population is a little bit of a different ethnic group that exists within the Arab Middle Eastern world. They are mostly Sunni Muslims. However, they worship a little bit differently than, say, the Saudi Sunnis, the Wahhabis. And, you know, there's many different types of Muslim faith and all that kind of stuff anyways. Like I said, the Kurds don't have their own state. I believe they're the largest ethnic group in the entire, you know, world without a state where they're the majority population in. Most of this was intentional in the carving up of the Middle East after World War I, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Looking, you know, and this is why Iraq was divided the way it was, where there was a, you know, Sunni minority controlling the Shia majority. You had the opposite case in Syria, where you had an Alawite minority controlling a Sunni majority. And so this was, you know, I guess the idea to keep repression, kind of similar to what some of the countries did in Africa, where they, you know, took the minority white populations and put them in charge of the majority native black populations. And so we kind of had that situation there. And this has lasted till today, where you have the different sections of the Kurds, because the Iraqi Kurds are pretty distinctly different in their beliefs from the Syrian Kurds. The Syrian Kurds are known as the YPG, and they make up the backbone of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that's the official group of fighters that the United States bats in Syria. Although we know from a defected Arab SDF general who's kind of come out and said, there's really no Arabs fighting in the SDF. They're just kind of there for the United States to give the arms to so they could give them to the Kurds. The reason the United States can't directly arm the Syrian Kurds is because Turkey also has a large Kurdish population. Those Kurds are a little bit different than the Syrian Kurds, but they get along pretty well. The Turkish Kurds follow like a political movement and militia known as the PKK, and this is labeled a terrorist group by the United States, Turkey, and other countries. Whether they are a terrorist organization or, kind of just an insurgency fighting under the oppressive dictatorship in Turkey, you could debate. But Turkey also says, well, the PKK is linked with the YPG, and so the YPG is a terrorist organization too. The United States and our European allies say, we really don't see it. They're a distinctly different group, and these are the people we're choosing to arm in back in Syria.
So how does this bode for the United States then?
Well, the invasion, not very well. Last week, I believe it was the 17th, Tillerson gave a speech at the Hoover Institute, which is Stanford. And what he said in that speech, a big part of it was the United States was going to kind of back a 30,000-man border force in Syria. And this was a big part of the United States strategy to continue to bat the SDF. Now, since the backbone of the SDF is the YPG and Turkey is attacking the YPG, and Turkey is a NATO ally of the United States, and the United States has a couple dozen nuclear weapons in Turkey. And so this is, is really creating a problem where the YPG is the United States strategic ally in Syria, and we continue to give them weapons at the same time that's angering our NATO allies in Turkey.
So, and I know that you and Will Porter covered Tillerson's speech in your most recent episode. What was that entitled?
That was Foreign Policy Focus 144, Tillerson's Losing Speech. And the title is Tillerson's Losing Speech, or Losing Policy, with Will Porter. I think we did a pretty good job of going through and covering a lot of the, minor details in the Syrian civil war and just how, kind of the United States got to where we are today in Syria, where, we still have Al-Qaeda controlling a portion of the country. ISIS has returned to an insurgency, but it's still a problem. And now we have Turkey invading Syria. Also, this has been a little bit less of a problem, but Israel is still saying that they have an Assad must go policy and have carried out at least a couple hundred airstrikes in Syria at this point.
Okay, and I know kind of, well, and this isn't the unspoken story, but another big factor in this is the Russian presence inside of Syria. And in some of the articles that I was reading in prep for this interview, I saw that Russia had soldiers deployed in that province with the Syrian Kurds. So they have since moved out of the area, is what I read. But can you talk a little bit about how Russia plays into this? Because they've been propping up Assad and actively involved there.
Yeah, so one of the complicated things about the Afrin enclave for the Kurds is that this is a separate section of Syria, and it's not connected to the larger state that the Kurds have in eastern Syria. So the United States can't kind of put troops in there because in the eastern Syria, the United States has troops more or less on the border with the Syrian Kurds, where they either go up against the Turkish state or against the Turkish-backed Syrian rebels, again, largely Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra type jihadists. And so the United States was able to deter Kurdish aggression or Turkish aggression against the Kurds for a long time by having the U.S. troops there. The United States couldn't deploy those troops in Afrin, like I said, because there's a large chunk held by the Syrian state in between. So the Kurds had cut deals with the Russians. I think there were even some not Russian bases, but small, Russian posts in the Afrin province. And so this was kind of the other way that the Kurds kept the Turks from attacking, was by making deals with Russia. It seems that Russia was pretty upset about the United States' 30-man border force made out of the Kurds in eastern Syria. And that was part of the reason that they ended up cutting this deal with Erdogan and cutting the Kurds loose.
Okay.
And Erdogan's the leader of Turkey, sorry.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So one thing that I've noticed, and this is kind of taking a step back, but for someone who's kind of new to foreign policy like me, maybe some members of my audience, talking about how, and maybe this is a libertarian thing too, is how we always see the world in terms of borders and government-defined borders, but things are so complicated in the Middle East that maybe there's different tribes and different ethnic groups. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe the political borders in the Middle East are different than what we would see as lines on a map. Would that be an accurate statement?
Well, right. And I mean, this is most true. I guess Afghanistan isn't necessarily in the Middle East, but in Afghanistan, I mean, they really cut the Pashtun areas in half there. And so, there's a lot of people who don't even know what the United States is. I believe it was, there's a valley in Afghanistan that the United States went into at one point, and the people honestly didn't know what the United States was. A lot of parts of Afghanistan, when the United States troops came, they thought they were still the USSR. They had no idea the Soviet Union even collapsed. And so, the imaginary lines drawn on the map for them mean nothing. I think once you get into Syria and the rest of the Middle East, you don't have like the mountainous region. And so it's probably a little less of a like isolated villages, and so they're all aware of the borders. But at the same time, the reason that the Islamic State formed in the shape it did when they actually had their caliphate, and I'll go back to the map to kind of point this out, is that the Islamic State's right here. Well, that's all the real Sunni area of it. So you kind of just see the way that these things end up working out. Is that when the kind of the natural militia upforms of ISIS, they go through and they take all the Sunni lands.
All right, so at this point, we kind of got the details on exactly what happened this weekend. Maybe we can revisit that, but do you want to give us a little briefing on what the current state of affairs is in Syria? Because I think for a lot of people, the last time Syria was really in the news was when the Assad gassing his own people thing happened last year. And I think a lot of people have proven that, like Ron Paul was saying, that the Assad gassing his own people incident was a false flag situation. But do you want to talk a little bit about what has happened since then and what the current state of affairs is?
Okay, yeah. So I guess since then, the Islamic State as a caliphate and as like an actual territory holding organization has been defeated. This is true on both sides of the Iraq and Syria border. I do think there may be like little holdouts here and there where ISIS holds a village around Syria, but the caliphate itself is gone. In the northern province of Idlib, the Al-Qaeda fighters and the Al-Nusra fighters, along with the rest of the Syrian rebel groups, most of whom are at least linked to jihadist groups, if not actual jihadist groups, are losing territory to the Syrian army and the Russian army, who are waging a pretty brutal air war and ground war against the people there. If you look, hundreds of people are dying every couple weeks from their air war. And, that's just to be honest about the situation. Of course, I think the United States killed about 6,000 civilians fighting against ISIS in 2017. The Kurds continue to hold eastern Syria, and they have the backing of the United States. Turkey is now invading the Afrin enclave. I believe the Syrian and Lebanon border has been pretty much, if not completely, cleared of any terrorist presence. And then the only other place you have Syrian rebels is along the border with Jordan, where you have a small blip where the United States holds a base at Al-Tamp and protects a region of rebels around there. And then the Israelis have been pretty defiant and not allowing the Syrians to approach the Golan Heights. And so there's some rebels there that still exist along that border. And I think those are pretty clearly Al-Qaeda-linked jihadist rebels as well. The Syrian government is working to clear a couple neighborhoods near Damascus. Those campaigns, again, have been brutal. I think finally some aid is gained to those cities who have been besieged since 2011. And I think that's another thing to remember here, is that while the United States side, the side the United States won, it may not be winning this war. There's been a lot of people who have been living in absolute warlike conditions with shellings occurring all the time, a lack of aid, a lack of food coming in, a lack of water, complete insecurity. I mean, even, if Assad isn't the most humanitarian person and, is somewhat of a monster himself, at least having like a year or 6 months for these people to be like, okay, like, let's have a normal life where my kids go to school and I go to the market without getting blown up. it would probably be very, very meaningful at this point.
And moving back even further then, what was it exactly, just for the people in the audience who are completely unfamiliar with the history, what was it in the first place that was so terrible that Assad did? I heard something about there were demonstrations and men with guns showed up and were shooting people. Is that the main impetus behind the Assad must go narrative?
So yeah, so what happens is that you have the Arab Spring in Tunisia, and then I believe Libya, and then Syria and Yemen. The Arab Spring in Syria, there were a lot of people that were legitimately upset about some of the oppression of the Assad government of the people. That being said, Syria, at least prior to the Syrian civil war, wasn't the least liberal country in the Middle East. Certainly, if you look at the way our Gulf allies have treated their civilians in Bahrain, the Emirates, and in Saudi Arabia, that's much worse than the Syrians. Assad treated the Syrians. But like I said, there's legitimate oppression going on, and people aren't living the lives that of liberty and freedom that I live here in the United States. So there's some uprising. I think this is especially among the Sunni communities, and then some of that rebellion starts to take up weapons, and then there's fighting between the Syrian government and the protesters. Now, we could sit here and argue, and I don't think anybody really knows, who fired on who first. Or if the maybe the armed resistance was just trying to protect the rebels, like you would have in the United States with like the 3%ers or whatever going out and trying to defend some people at a free speech event, or if they were there to intentionally fire on the police, forcing the police to fire on the crowd. I suppose either is possible. We do know that during this time, the United States was running a CIA program out of Benghazi to the consulate in Turkey, where we are funneling weapons to Syrian rebels, many of whom turned out to be jihadists. We now have official reports saying that within 2 months, weapons were going from quote-unquote moderate Syrian rebels to jihadist ISIS groups. So, whatever the United States was doing, whether they were directly arming the jihadist rebels themselves, whether it was just poor vetting, or it was that the United States was giving, the weapons to the moderate rebels, and they were turning around and selling the weapons or having them taken from them. The actual effects were that the weapons were going to the jihadists very early on in the Syrian civil war.
Okay, and then so fast forward to about a year ago, because there were several times when the Assad gassing his own people narrative came forward, weren't there? There was one that I'm remembering from 2017. I think Obama.
That's Khan Sheikhoun. That was April 4th of 2017, I believe. And the very interesting thing about that is just days before that attack, both, I believe, Nikki Haley and Rex Tillerson had came out and said more or less that the United States policy in Syria is no longer Assad must go. This was kind of the campaign promise that Trump had made, was that the United States wasn't going to waste time in Syria messing with Assad. Our goal, we are going to bomb ISIS. I think Trump's quote was, we're going to knock the hell out of ISIS, and then we're going home. And so this seemed to be the plan. Assad was clearly winning the Syrian civil war. It looked like he was running over both ISIS and the Al-Qaeda opposition, was quickly moving towards Deir ez-Zor, and then the chemical weapons attack happens, and everything changes after that. The United States policy flips. Suddenly, we're attacking Syrian air base there. I think we launched like 59 Tomahawk missiles. 9 or 19 actually hit the target. We end up shooting down a Syrian civil jet around Tabika, and then we continue to bomb Syrian allied militias in the south of Syria around Al-Tanf, claiming that 15 miles from a U.S. base is too close. Essentially, just protecting ISIS there, though. So, in that chemical weapons attack, what it looks like actually happened was the Russian and Syrian government. I believe the Syrian Air Force actually carried out the attack. The Russians notified the Americans, and what they did is they struck an Al-Qaeda headquarters or some kind of depot where Al-Qaeda leadership was meeting. The interesting thing, one of the ways Al-Qaeda controls local populations is not only do they hold on to things like weapons, but they also hold on to fertilizer, household chemicals, sanitary supplies. And so essentially you have a place where, you have all kinds of different, fertilizers, and chemicals, and then you drop a bomb on it, and not to mention that there's probably weapons there as well. And so you get this huge gas cloud that comes out of there and ends up getting quite a few people sick. This seems to be both supported by the reporting of Seymour Hersh and the MIT expert Timothy Postal.
Okay, yeah. So that was I used the term false flag, but now I'm remembering that that was the impetus behind the CNN clip with Thomas Massey, where he's saying it's like the day after the attack, and the CNN anchor is just incredulous, and he's talking about how he's heard that there's these weapons caches that could have been hit. And so that is the established narrative now, that or the objectively proven situation of what had happened.
No, the U.S. government still gets it wrong, but that's what happened.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I guess you can't prove it, but even Will Porter points out that even within the UN report, you have a huge problem because people are arriving to the hospital before the reported time of the chemical weapons attack. You have like, I think a huge number, like maybe 20% of the alleged victims get to the hospital before the attack allegedly occurred, and the hospitals are, a couple hours away.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. So there's a lot of problems with this story. And it could be, too, that, maybe there's a little bit of a false flag sense that they attempted to exploit it. Like this strike happened, there's a gas cloud, a couple people die. And so then maybe they kill some other people and, go, dump the bodies in the hospital, or have other people claim they were sick, give them something to make them throw up, send them to the hospital. That way you could claim there's 200 victims instead of 5.
Yeah, and then use that for your political means. But so one thing I wanted to have you talk about was the difference between all of these rebel groups. Can you define the parties like the Free Syrian Army? There's al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and ISIS. And what are the differences between these groups?
So I guess at the current point, not much. ISIS and al-Qaeda are completely separate groups. Mostly completely separate groups. They split from each other pretty on. It was all AQI, which is al-Qaeda in Iraq. And then Baghdadi split off from that group. And then you had al-Nusra, I believe still run by Zarqawi. Al-Nusra, has changed its name a few times during the Syrian civil war, really confusing it. But what happened, I think starting around 2015, all the rebel groups started forming coalitions with each other. And so there was a group, Zinke, and this is the group, if anybody saw the video, there's a little boy in the back of the truck. I believe he's about 8 years old. And you have this guy like petting his head and being really nice to him, and then just cuts his head off. It's absolutely disgusting. And this is a group that then gets in an alliance with the Free Syrian Army, and suddenly they're getting U.S. weapons. You have now pretty much at this point, all the armed opposition to Assad that are part of the coalition that aren't ISIS are linked to Turkey. And I believe they've all announced that they're in an alliance now. Now, from time to time, all these rebel groups fight with each other because you have guys like that are hardcore jihadists, either from China or France or Tunisia, Libya, Iraq, who are there to carry out the jihad and impose an Osama bin Laden view on the world. And then I think you also have people who just don't want to live under Assad. And so every once in a while that these groups all end up shooting at each other. But at this point, you could just say, the armed opposition is all linked to al-Qaeda, and they're I believe at this point, they're all still fighting together against Assad. Now, this will probably change in 3 weeks when, somebody accidentally shoots somebody's fighters or something like that. And then there's a little split up and fighting again internally within the Syrian opposition.
I'm glad that you mentioned the Zinke incident, because of the few things that stay in my mind, because I haven't actually sat down yet to study this kind of stuff, but I'm getting there. But one of the clearest things in my mind was that incident, and I remember when it happened, of the Zinke terrorists beheading that little boy. And did you see the State Department footage of, I believe it was the RT reporter that was questioning the State Department representative about the Zinke organization? Did you see that?
I don't remember it. I probably did see it. It's not come to mind.
Oh, well, maybe I'll include, if I get time to edit this, I'll include the clip. But the reporter is saying, you know, he concludes by saying, what does a rebel group have to do in order to not receive U.S. funding? What kind of controversy do they get in to not receive U.S. funding? And it's a pretty powerful clip, but I'm sure you've seen it at some point in time.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter. The United States will arm anybody anywhere. Right now, I was reading a story out of Somalia, and what's happening there is a lot of the Al-Shabaab former commanders are defecting to the Somali army and are now receiving training from the United States. And so I was reading a story about this incident that happened where a bunch of civilians end up getting killed in Somalia. And it's like, this guy is a former Al-Shabaab commander, and that guy's a former Al-Shabaab commander. And so it's like, what are we doing? What are, you know, in Ukraine, we're arming Nazis now. In Afghanistan, we're arming the side allied with the Iranians. You know, everywhere we're backing the wrong side.
Yeah. But at the same time, you know, Trump saying that Haiti is a shithole. And you had a great episode about this the other week when it happened. Yeah, of course, if my audience hasn't checked out Kyle's stuff yet, definitely do that. But just the disconnect between liberals getting so upset about Trump saying mean things, or about Trump being a Nazi, or the alt-right being Nazis, but the State Department and the United States were literally arming Nazis in Ukraine, and they don't have anything to say about that.
Right.
It's just, yeah.
It's absolutely amazing that when, you know, Trump says shithole about Africa, people go absolutely insane. But if you're going to describe a place that is a shithole, you would say, oh, well, everybody gets raped and there's slavery and there's like warring militias all over the place. You know, nobody even controls a half of the country. And that's exactly what, you know, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama turned Libya into. And nobody cares about that. In fact, you're a racist for not voting for Hillary Clinton. And yet, you know, they want to take the moral stand that, you know, we have to help all these poor oppressed people. And it's like, you're hurting them all over the place, and you don't actually blame anybody who's actually guilty of it. Even now, the thing about Trump is that Bush is preferable. And it's like, if you want to talk about all the mess in the Middle East, the Iraq war was really that. As, you know, as bad as messing up Afghanistan was, it didn't, you know, create the jihadist movement in the Anbar province of Iraq, and then spread that into Libya and so many other countries. I mean, it's really destabilized and changed the whole Middle East. Iraq and Saddam Hussein was always a huge check on Iran. I mean, that was always Iran's big competition with Saddam Hussein. And by taking him out and then giving the capital city of Baghdad and the rest of the country to Iran, it completely changes. I mean, look, I'll go back to the map real quick just so everybody can see. And actually, this time I'm going to use the maps that Scott Horton's book, Fool's Errand, which is great. But he has a bunch of great maps on his site. And here's one of them. And just look, Iraq is a huge state here, right? I mean, it takes up a large point there. It borders Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran. And it plays critical importance to the Middle East. And taking that state and giving it to the opposite power is a huge, you know, changing move. And it's what the United States has been complaining about, is Iranian expanding influence and Iranian aggression. And a big portion of what the United States is allegedly doing in Syria is preventing the land bridge from Tehran to Beirut, which is, you know, the capital of Libya and the capital of Iran. But that land bridge was created in 2003 and then in 2006 during the Iraqi Civil War, where the United States under George W. Bush fought for the biggest victory Iran has had.
Yeah, it's just messy. Well, and it makes me think of Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard. And I haven't read much, like I haven't actually read the book, but hearing people like James Corbett talk about how the Middle East is so central, just because these conflicts go back for centuries. You know, we're essentially the same powers are struggling over. I mean, Iraq is the cradle of civilization, you know, talked about so often. It's just sad that things haven't improved.
Right. And the worst part about it is that, the United States has come in as the world's greatest superpower ever and has just kicked the whole thing over.
Yeah.
Right. And so any kind of like stability that would be forming as like, because people don't war forever. Eventually, that the powers that are the strongest start to like maintain their hold. And then everything starts to kind of take shape. And while that, maybe a little bit, there's some oppression in there, by kicking the whole thing over, it's just, turned it into chaos. I mean, looking at specifically the situations in Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and Libya, I mean, it's absolute chaos.
Yeah. And it's just too bad. It's hard to imagine, like you said, living in the United States and being, mostly free. I know we have our quibbles with our living situation, but it's absolutely nothing compared to just the horrible atrocities that are going on right now. But to kind of to go back a little bit, focus a little bit on the events of this past weekend. I wanted to go over how Turkey is balanced between, it seems to me from what you were saying earlier, it's balanced between US influence and the NATO side and Russia. How does that play out again? I know you touched on it, but
so this is one of the really complicated things, and I actually did a whole episode on kind of Turkey's position right now in the Middle East, and I think I call it Turkey's game. It might be episode 143. I can send you a link after we're done here. And what I did on that show is kind of go through it and look at what Turkey's role in the history of the Syrian civil war has been. Because remember, at one point, Turkey had actually shot down a Russian jet that may or may not have crossed into Turkish airspace. I believe that was in either late 2015 or early 2016. Of course, in the summer of 2016, there was a major coup in Ukraine, in Turkey, an attempted coup in which Erdogan was, allegedly personally attacked and kind of saved the country for himself with a FaceTime message to the country, telling the people to go out to the streets and chase the soldiers out, which is what happened. And it's been a huge power grab where Erdogan has seized a lot of emergency powers and held on to them. He's also made himself more powerful by attacking the Kurds within Turkey. There has been in the past some, truces made between the Turkish government and the PKK in times of relative peace. But in response to the coup, Erdogan took an opportunity to take out, I think, some of his Kurdish opponents as well. I think many members of the Turkish parliament that are members of the PKK have all been arrested and are in jail. There's several in that case, especially the leadership there. And so a lot has been going on with Turkey and their role during the Syrian civil war. What the Turks have done, though, is they purchased the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. And I think this is probably the best surface-to-air missile system in the world, beating out the American Patriot missile systems or the THAAD missile systems. And this is because just looking at what they're capable of, they take out planes, weapons, and have planes, missiles, and have a very long range. So this has really been a problem because prior to this, NATO had a united air defense system because everybody had purchased the U.S.-made weapons. Now, this is probably just a boondoggle for Lockheed Martin, who was getting absolutely rich off the death of millions and, the dime of American people and the lives of American soldiers here. But, this is, at least in Washington, it is seen as a real problem. Erdogan has also really buddied up with Putin, and they seem to have formed a relationship, at least to the point where Turkey was able to cut a deal with Russia for Russia to withdraw from the Afrin province so Turkey could move in. I don't think Turkey would have invaded Afrin if there were Russian troops on the front lines, because Turkish troops wouldn't have rolled over or killed Russian troops because that's a fight that Turkey probably can't win.
Yeah.
And then again, Turkey is a NATO ally, is a host to nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons. The U.S. has a big air base in Turkey, the Incirlik Air Base. And I believe Turkey has the second largest standing army in NATO, only behind the United States at 500,000 troops. It's the only NATO country in Asia. And so there's a lot of reasons that Turkey is an important member of NATO. and is an important part of the American global strategy. And I think one of the amazing things to me is that Tillerson gave his speech last week. It was apparently unable to predict the actions of Turkey, a NATO ally. And so I understand that Turkey's been making this threat for years. And it's not like the middle of last week I was out there saying Turkey's definitely going to attack Afrin. The reason I had predicted that and didn't think Turkey would attack Afrin is I didn't think Russia was going to back off. I think this is probably not the best move by Russia, just because this adds a whole nother piece of complexity to the Syrian civil war. If Turkey holds a portion of Syria, then any negotiations to end the war will have to include Turkey, where they may have been able to keep Turkey out of the position if they were able to not having a seat at the table, if they weren't able to defeat the Syrian rebels backed by Turkey in the end of it anyways. So, I don't know if it was a good move by Russia. Of course, I think it's possible that other countries like the United States made blunders on the foreign policy stage. But for the United States not to know that Turkey was actually going to follow through with it and we're serious about attacking the YPG. And also remember, I think the reason that Turkey did this is in retaliation for the United States creating the 30,000 man army of Kurds in Syria. I think it seemed as Turkey to be a real threat to their country.
So I know you kind of touched on this, but obviously this adds a whole new, because it's an opening of a whole new front in the Syrian civil war. So how bad is this? Like, I know it's more complex than just good or bad, but how does this bode for the whole conflict? Obviously we're hoping for peace. We are non-interventionists, but how does it bode for the Syrian people?
Well, I guess, I mean, like there did seem to be an opportunity, maybe a light at the end of the tunnel starting to shine through there with the Syrians and Russians and Iranians all teamed up together, defeating the armed opposition, the Idlib province. Then the only remaining opposition to Assad in the vast majority of Syria would have been the YPG. Now, it could have ended up being all-out war between the YPG and Assad government. I'm not saying that the United States would have backed off. Just look how incompetent they are. But at the same time, there's, finally in the Syrian civil war, only two sides fighting each other. And so then it seems like maybe there's a simple resolution that could come out of it. However, with Turkey now invading, it seems to be kind of a whole new ballgame. And Turkey is also threatening to invade the eastern Kurdish state as well that actually has the U.S. troops there. And so we may not see the end of Turkish aggression in Syria. I know Assad doesn't want Turkey in Syria and has been very vocal about that throughout the war, but it's hard to tell, what Assad will do, if anything.
And one of my last questions is maybe one of the hardest questions of all is how do we get the United States public to care about this? Because it's super complicated. And even intelligent people can get caught up in the quagmire. And with all the moving parts, it's so hard to just put this together in your head. So what is the best way to engage people on this? And maybe there isn't a good answer.
Well, at one point in time, I mean, the Syrian civil war was so complex. There was like 13 distinct different coalitions or countries fighting within Syria, that I was really going like, hey guys, this is a real Game of Thrones we have going on in the world right now. Thinking that would spike some interest, people going, oh man, like, everybody loves the complexities of Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow. But then when it's real life, I guess, maybe you can't look at it as entertainment because it's so bloody and terrible. One of the few really effective measures was when you had the U.S., Marines taking pictures. They have signs over their face, but you could see all their ribbons and they're in their fatigues saying, I didn't enlist to fight for ISIS or Al Qaeda or something like that. I think that was very effective. And so if there are, any military members out there listening to this, and, don't go, if you don't want to get yourself in trouble, I understand. But if you're in a position where you could either anonymously make a statement like that, or, if you do have the courage to come out and publicly do it, I think it could make a real difference, because, the wars are always fought on behalf of the dead troops now, right? one of the reasons we can't leave Afghanistan is, well, then the Taliban will take back over. And what were the 2,500 American lives for? And so because of those troops, we have to continue fighting forever. And so the troops are coming out and saying like, hey, man, this is a bad idea and we no longer want to do it. Then, that's pretty significant. I try to play up the America as helping the terrorist portion because I do think Americans continue to really view only the terrorists as the problems. I don't think the American people actually think Assad is going to launch an attack against the United States. And even in Tillerson's speech, he has to very, falsely say that Assad being in control of Syria is a security threat to the United States because Assad is going to use or allow the terrorists to operate in Syria and have a safe haven. That's another reason why the United States needs to be there. And so saying, no, what's going on in Syria right now is the United States is getting in the way of Russia and Syria defeating all the terrorists in Syria. What's going on right now in Yemen is the United States is fighting on a war on behalf of Syria. What happened in Libya is the United States fought an air war against Gaddafi on behalf of the terrorists, and now they absolutely thrive in the destabilization. That the continued war in Afghanistan and then the U.S. drone war in Pakistan has driven a group that's now calling itself the Islamic State of the Khorasan to exist in northern Afghanistan. And so everywhere the United States goes, all we're doing is spreading terrorism. The Libyan civil war also spread a lot of terrorists. We now have, I believe it's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Merlob, which is the terrorist group there out in West Africa, Nigeria, Mali, Chad, Cameroon, kind of operating in that area, Burkina Faso. All those countries have actually, I think, formed a coalition with France that exists within the UN, where they're fighting against there. And obviously, we have thousands of U.S. troops in that region as well. But everywhere the United States goes to fight terrorism, and all of our foreign policy only ends up aiding the terrorists at the end of the day. Sorry, I think I got on a little tangent there. But yeah, the United States is helping terrorists, and that's a big problem.
No, the tangent is welcome. But you really went into detail on this on a recent episode too, which was the war's cost on Americans. And which number was that? I'm trying to plug all your stuff so that we can...
I think that was 144. I think that was the episode before this last one. I put that one out on Friday.
Okay, yeah, definitely would direct everyone to check that one out. I think we're going to bring things to a close here, but for everyone listening in the audio version of the podcast, there is also a video version that was live streamed to YouTube. I'll include that in at libertyweekly.net/51. And as always, Kyle, do you want to tell everyone where they can find your content?
Yeah, the best place to find the podcast, which is Foreign Policy Focus, is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. You can also find all my work at the Libertarian which is Scott Horton's institute. I do a pretty much daily Monday through Friday blog post there, daily news roundup. I try just to take all the important stories that I find throughout the world, link them to there. And then you can also find my podcast on that page. It's at /Kyle, or it's on the homepage right under Scott's show.
Okay, awesome. Well, everyone go check that out and keep pressing for non-interventionism and peace. War is mass murder. War is a racket. I know we're on the side of righteousness here, so let's keep on keeping on, even though there's a lot of evil in the world right now. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Kyle, for joining me for this episode. And let's hope that things get better for the Syrian people.
All right. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks.